Well, thanks everybody for coming out. This is our first speaker series event of the new semester. This is our fourth one altogether. Um, Quick show of hands, who's been to one of these events so far? Yes, yes. I recognize some faces. Okay, well, welcome back. Everybody else, welcome. Thanks for coming. This is the speaker series presented by the Center for Story at Shenandoah. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the director of the center. And real quick, what the center is, we are working on creating an MA in strategic narrative and story that we're hoping to launch fall of 25, so a year from now. And Matt Core in the communications department is helping shepherd that. And I'm directing the center, which is for now a virtual space and is going to be dedicated to year-round programming, things like this, all student-focused to really both celebrate and interrogate how story and narrative interact with all aspects of culture and society. And we'll get into that a little bit tonight, but by way of introduction, where I'm coming from as a writer, nonprofit director, and arts advocate, I firmly believe, certainly on the literal level, story and storytelling serves a purpose and is easy to understand. But I think when we start to look at how not only is story in everything, but everything could be said to be story. So whether you're talking about a business plan or a political campaign or something on the radio or how a museum is run, all of these things are stories, and the people that are in charge of these narratives have agendas. So our ability to understand what's happening and connect the dots helps us be better informed and also helps us understand what's real, what's fake, and who's doing what for what reasons. And tonight we're going to tackle that and go deeper into how technology impacts that. So my goal for this series is to have experts come and talk about what they do and how story intersects with their areas of specialty, and how those areas are changing, impacted by technology and culture. So I could not be more happy. We have the most appropriate and cool person to feature, Dr. Nathan Prestopnik. Thank you, Nathan, for being here. Give Nathan a round of applause. For those of you, a quick show of hands, who has had or has Dr. Prestopnik for a class? Okay, so they're a little bit of a fan club, and those of you that don't, this is perfect because you're going to get a chance to see what he does and the kinds of things that excite him. But let me read his bio so we know what we're dealing with here. The good doctor is a professor of virtual reality design at Shenandoah, is also co-director of the Shenandoah Center for Immersive Learning, a state-of-the-art immersive lab and studio. He earned his PhD in information science at Syracuse University and holds dual bachelor degrees in film production and history, an MS in new media, and an MPhil in information science. I don't even know what that means. That's how impressive that is. In 2024, he also published his first novel, World Without Rain, a science fiction epic adventure about airships, monsters, futuristic technology, military conflict, amazing places, and fascinating people. Speaking of fascinating people, Nathan, thanks for being here. Because not everyone here has had the pleasure of your tutelage, why don't we kick it off and you talk a little bit about how this amazing and impressive bio translates to what you do both inside the classroom and out, and how you approach your discipline, and then we can get into the whole story thing.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me be here, and thanks for attending. I know that many of you could be doing other things this evening, so I really appreciate it. It's nice to have you here, nice to be able to chat with you. Yeah, so I would say I'm a lifelong storyteller, and that's where a lot of that bio comes from. I was really interested in film from a very young age. I actually, my first college degree, the thing I went to school for originally, was filmmaking. I love visual storytelling. I love making cool experiences for people and making them fun. So here at Shenandoah, I teach courses where I get to talk with cool, interesting people like you about that kind of stuff. So I teach some of our game design classes. I teach intro game design in a more advanced class where we dissect what makes games work and what's happening up here when you play a game and why games often feel so addictive, and what kinds of stories work for games. And I teach our virtual reality lab classes where we use different game engines to build VR experiences. I teach design classes that are focused sometimes on graphic design, sometimes focused on the design of user experiences in all different media, web and VR and mobile applications and other things. So I'm really interested in the design of things and the making of things in the way that those experiences become stories that you're excited about and passionate about and interested in. And so a lot of my research, because as an academic, your job is to write really boring papers for even more boring people. But a lot of my research is also focused on games and often using games to do more serious things, like to use a game to do scientific tasks or use a game to teach something or things like that. So it's usually pretty fun.
And by the way, I should have mentioned right up front, these are very informal events. So I encourage questions and comments throughout. So as we're going, if anyone has a thought, comment, critique, shoot your hand up and we'll make sure you're heard. So don't save it till the end. Jump in wherever you want or need. So Nathan, I think two ways I'd love to attack story, and you have to kind of story. I feel like in the 20th century, for those of us that are dinosaurs, story used to be, it was just immediately associated with books. Like story is movies, it's narrative media. And I think one of the cool things that's happened in the 21st century as technology has gotten increasingly sophisticated and is increasingly a part of not only our entertainment life, but our day-to-day reality, we are understanding, I think your generation, broadly speaking, gets like, yeah, of course story is everything. Of course this is storytelling. I actually think it's the older generation that doesn't really appreciate the way these things are intimately connected. But drilling down specifically on the classes you teach, how would you explain to someone, again, whether it's somebody here or the aforementioned, older generation, like that said, yeah, but story is like a skill set. You're telling a story. And I think we want to complicate it. There's a lot more going on. So how does technology both impact and basically better inform how people use narrative and how people tell their stories?
Yeah, so that's a pretty interesting question. I guess I start with this. I think everyone is a storyteller. I wonder if you agree. You all tell stories, right? Just in your day to day. You come home from classes and you're like, this crazy, stupid thing happened. I got to tell you about it. It was ridiculous. We're all storytellers, and we like telling stories because they help us make sense of the world and they help us share things that are interesting to us and learn more about each other. So I start with the idea everyone is a storyteller. And when we teach storytelling, particularly for specific genres or specific media or specific technologies, what we're really teaching is how you take our natural innate ability to tell a story and we impose a technological layer on it, and we start adding specific forms that are known to work well for specific genres. So my first degree, like I mentioned, was filmmaking. And so in film school, I learned a lot of specific things about telling stories for film, how you write a screenplay, how you structure a story for film into three acts is the kind of popular traditional screenwriting act structure. So learning about story structure for that, approximately 90 minutes to 2 hour genre, right? And then I learned a lot of technical material about cameras and lights and editing systems and sound production and all the things that go into like making a professional motion picture. Here, I don't teach as much filmmaking, but I teach VR design. So we talk about those technologies and the way they impose certain structures and certain forms on the stories that we all naturally, innately want to tell each other. And VR is a really interesting medium because, like filmmaking, as a director, I have control over a camera, right? And I dictate to you what you experience in my story. But in VR, I'm putting you in a world and I'm giving you control over the story that I've created for you. I'm giving you ways to interact with it and ways to choose which parts of it you want to engage with and which parts of it you want to ignore. And that poses some really interesting challenges, some really interesting kind of like designer questions about how we do that and whether we should exert more control over the experience or whether we should give you more control over the experience. You've probably, some of you play games. Do you play games? Are you game players? Some of you are game players. You've probably played games where you feel like the game designer is just showing you a movie. Is that true? And it's sometimes it doesn't work, right? Because you're expecting to have control. Whereas if you sit down at your TV and you watch a movie, you're expecting that and you're fine with it, right? Because the technology imposes like a different way of interacting with the story, and we start to get used to the conventions of these technologies, and we start sort of anticipating them. So that's a big part of it, I think, is like when you're telling a story, think about which medium you're going for and what are the kind of conventions, and then maybe how can you even break those conventions in an interesting way. That's kind of when you get to peak like creativity. You know the rules, now you can start breaking them in cool ways.
I love that. And what I get from what you just said, Nate, is among other things, I think the more traditional storytelling as we understand it was the storyteller was in control, was using an understood framework, and they did what they did, and there was a consistency. So whether you're talking about, the Greek myths all the way to novels being written this century, a story is a story, and the storyteller owns the rules of engagement. But with VR, in a sense, the storyteller becomes the user, and that whole experience is different. I feel like that at once complicates what story can be, but it also opens up all kinds of possibilities. And I when I think as a non-techie kind of person, I always find that fascinating and liberating, the ways that story can just be exploded. So I think more traditional people might be frightened by that and say, you're ruining, this is what story is in this box. And what you're talking about is story can be a million different things, a million different possibilities. Talk a little bit about how that changes, like how we understand story and what some of those possibilities are, and whether that's a good thing or are there any drawbacks?
Yeah, so are there drawbacks? Well, I guess I'll start with the idea of like what we can expand to. So as soon as you start thinking of a story as something someone will experience, and you're just kind of shaping it in some way that suits the genre and the medium, right? These examples of very interactive stories where we give you, the audience, control, they do open up a ton of possibilities. I'm thinking of like Minecraft, pictures of any Minecraft players in here now or in the past? Minecraft is a super cool game, maybe one of the best designed games ever. And it's because in a way it isn't a game. Really, it's just an environment that you can mess around with. And what I think is really fascinating about it from a story standpoint is that the designers didn't impose the story upon you. Well, most games do. A lot of games do. They just made a vehicle for you to goof around with your friends and create stories for yourself. So they've actually just given you an empty journal with blank pages. And that's actually that's like a hard thing to do as a designer. Like for me, that would be a really difficult game to design because I want to tell stories I care about instead of just giving you a vehicle to tell stories you care about, right? Kind of like we're up here telling you stories that we care about. Do you care about them? I don't know. I hope so. I kind of think about that kind of level of freedom. And then I think about like your question, like, are there drawbacks to something like that? And I don't know that there are. I mean, like I said, we're all human beings are storytellers, and we find all different ways to tell our stories. And so I think it's perfectly valid to tell stories in lots of different ways. But I do think if you're going to start trying to make stories to entertain other people, like as entertainment media, it is worthwhile to understand the structures that have been around for a long time and are well understood and have a proven track record of working. Because the story you tell about your crazy day in the dining hall or whatever when you get home at the end of the day, that might be a super great, fun story. It also might just be a story that's interesting to you and your two friends, and like no one else in the world is going to pay a ticket to like buy a ticket to watch that. Whereas if you structure it in a way we're used to, that could actually turn into like a fantastically funny, cool movie or a really interesting video game, right? So those structures, I think they do matter. And if there's critique of like super open-ended storytelling, it's that you're no longer making like commercially viable storytelling. You're just doing the thing we all do, which is tell each other stories about our day and what happened. I think that's my answer.
That's a great answer. So we've narrowed in on gaming, right? We've talked about traditional storytelling. How do some of these technologies, both, in terms of what you teach in the classroom, but thinking longer, societal view, like how are these technologies impacting society writ large? What are some ways we can better appreciate how story as it's used in media, as it's used in politics, as it's used, on TV and used by people that we wouldn't call artists. Maybe that's a better way to get what I'm talking about. Like artists, whatever they're doing, whatever medium they're using, they're trying to create entertainment of some sort. They're looking for engagement. Whereas in the political arena or the sales arena, the media arena, commercials, they're trying to sell something. Can you talk a little bit about how technology is both blurring and changing those lines?
I have opinions because we're in the era of social media, right? Like it's been around for a couple decades now, really, and my students are laughing because I yelp about this really all the time. We're in the era where anyone can go online and basically tell any story they want, which is a good thing, right? And I'm like a First Amendment absolutist, to be honest with you. So I think it's a good thing, and I think people should tell whatever stories and share whatever information they want to. At the same time, we're also in this era where now people can sort of yoke an agenda to that freedom and that power, and they can, so in the political arena or in the sales arena, commercial arena, we use these tools now, or some people use these tools now to further an agenda that may benefit them, but maybe doesn't benefit any of us. So like gripes that I have, I can't stand it that I'll like turn on my TV at home and the first thing it does is advertise to me, but I don't mean because I'm watching a show and there's a commercial, which is a very old way of funding TV. I mean that the menu of the TV I own advertises to me. I paid for the TV. I don't know why there should have to be an ad, but I'm an old man griping right now. But seriously, like someone decided they had to inject a story into my life to try to get me to buy something or watch something or subscribe to something. And most of these models now are stories that are trying to convince me to give up my personal information so that they can exploit it and make more money off of it in other ways. That's one. Or like you go online, right, and everyone has a political story. Like how many of you like go online and like the majority of what you see is people fighting about politics? Is that true? It's either that or weird TikTok videos, right? The political stuff is frustrating to me because you almost can't escape it. And it's like you go on there and we have such power through social media apps and mobile devices and like all these ways of creating content really fast and sharing it out. A lot of that stuff is there to tell you a story that someone wants you to believe. It may be true, it may not be true. Very often it's like partially true. It's like you're getting part of the story, but you're very often not getting the whole story. And that's not exclusive to one political party or one ideology. It's like everyone kind of shares the best framing for their agenda, right? And so we have this immense power to inject these stories into our lives. Everyone's like, we've got these stories everywhere. We can't escape them. They're actually obnoxious. They're like everywhere. And it starts to distort our worldview. And I actually think like we have this challenge with like anxiety and mental health. And these storytelling tools are like a big reason why. I personally think. I think that like I see a lot of you using phones and I'm like, that is basically derailing your brain into a set of stories that are designed to engage you. But the way social media companies and the way political campaigns, the way almost everyone engages you is by making you scared and making you feel bad. because that's how they get you to click and watch. Be scared and feel bad. So the stories we get are relentlessly negative in these on these devices, and I think that's a frightening thing. I think that's very, very concerning. I said I'm a First Amendment absolutist, so I don't know exactly what the answer is, because I don't think censorship is the answer. There are a lot of people who think censorship is the answer, that we should ban things or block things or stop things. I don't believe that. I believe in the First Amendment. I think we all have a right to say what we want to say. But I think a lot of people say things that are objectively pretty horrible and negative. And we used to have, I think, better standards for what storytelling made it into the mainstream. And I'm not sure, I think we've lost some of those. And so that's a challenge. That's a real challenge for us. I don't know if I have an answer, but I think that's a problem, at least. Maybe you all will have an answer someday.
So in a previous life, I was a technology analyst. And when Twitter first came out, this would have been around like 2007, 2008, we were very optimistic about what we considered a democratizing force of technology, specifically as it related to if people were like the notion of fake news and not trusting the media. That's a traditional generational issue that's always been there. I think it's gotten a lot worse for reasons that Nathan illustrates. But in 2008, a lot of us thought, and in hindsight, very naively, that with mechanisms like Twitter, it allowed citizens to help inform other citizens. So something happening in Iran that might have been censored in the traditional media there would be able to find light, and news could be exchanged freely across the world. And that was true. What I don't think we anticipated, because while we were naive, we weren't sufficiently cynical to recognize early on the same people that have the impulse to share news and the truth so that what's happening is seen objectively. There are very powerful and moneyed forces that have an entirely different agenda, including outright falsehoods, to create a narrative to generate fear or conflict, or in some cases, agreement. So as it relates to technology, I'd be interested, show of hands, who here would say they engage with social media on a regular basis? Show of hands. Who here thinks, and there's no wrong answers, I'm being very general, but is social media on balance a cause for good? Show of hands, and then a cause for bad. So social media on balance is a good thing. All right, show of hands, social media on balance is probably a negative thing. Okay. So more negative than positive. I'll defer to what are your reactions to that reaction?
Well, one thing I noted is a bunch of people, I think, weren't sure, or kind of in the middle somewhere. I saw a bunch of people who kind of didn't really put their hand up super aggressively for either. But it was very noticeable that I think only one or two people said social media could be is a force for good, at least now in 2024. That actually surprises me, because I expect all of you are quite avid users of it. So you're actually making the choice in your lives to use something that you believe, I'm assuming you're telling the truth, that you believe is good or is bad. You're choosing to use something that you know is bad. But then I also think, like, I make choices that are bad for me all the time. I'm drinking a Diet Pepsi. It's probably like my 5th one of the day, right? So like, we often make bad choices for ourselves because there's something we're getting out of it. And I think a lot of these kind of storytelling, social media type technologies, the era of the kind of tech cartel controlling our speech and our content, that stuff's fun, right? Like, TikTok videos are fun. YouTube videos are fun. Social media is fun. Chatting with your friends is fun. Getting random funny memes is fun. All that stuff is fun. And there's also utility. A lot of these things come with tools that are like useful for communication and for all kinds of stuff. So like, we do get something out of it, just like this is delicious and it moistens my parched throat. But yeah, it's not that good for me. It's kind of addictive. And there's been a lot of studies and a lot of looking now at these technologies and the way they engage you, the way they put you in a dopamine driven cycle. that keeps you clicking and keeps you looking and keeps you infinitely, the infinite scroll? The infinite scroll is dangerous, right? Like, how many of you have got caught in the infinite scroll? Yeah, it just goes and goes, and pretty soon you're doom scrolling, and you're like reading all the worst possible stories, and you're like terrified that the world is falling apart, right? Like, it's fun, but then at the same time, we can wind up down this rabbit hole of real negativity. And if you do that too often, instead of it being like, oh yeah, yesterday I kind of probably like, you lose perspective, and you start to think that that stuff is always how the world always is, right? You're like always going to have this doom sense that the world is falling apart around you. And that's too bad, because although there are plenty of negative things happening in the world, it's actually pretty good. There are a lot of things that are good about the world and good about the people around you, right? Like the people you get angry at on the internet, right? Have any of you gotten angry at someone on the internet? I'm guilty. I have done that once or twice. I try to self-censor, but we've been there. Some of you have been there. Or you've had someone get angry at you. How many of you had someone just get angry at you, blow up at you, some comment you made or some post you did? Yeah, it happens, right? Does that ever happen to you in your like actual day to day with like people who are around you? Like hardly ever, right? I mean, yeah, once in a while maybe someone's a jerk, but like mostly people are pretty nice. But the internet, that medium kind of brings out the worst in us sometimes. There's no consequences to saying something super mean or super negative, or distorting a story in a way that makes us look good and makes them look bad, right? And we have to be careful of that, because it isn't the real world. That's an electronic communication medium that's controlled by a lot of big commercial corporate interests and people who probably don't have your best interests at heart. And then it's a lot of people online who are there because it's fun, but also because sometimes people like that release of getting mad at someone and knowing there's not going to be consequences for saying the meanest thing possible, right? We don't do that in our real life because there are consequences to saying the meanest thing possible to someone if they're standing right there, right? But there aren't online usually, and so we sometimes indulge it. It's a thing to be careful of, I think. It's where some of the negativity actually comes from. It's kind of human nature. I don't know. I have no idea if that answered a question, but it was a thought anyway.
Absolutely. Before I ask my next question, comments, questions, thoughts? Yeah.
Exactly was it hard for for someone to get angry at someone over like comment they made on social media?
Yeah. Why? So why is it what?
Why is it pretty different? I know.
That's okay. You can keep going.
That's fine.
Well, maybe you're picking up on something I was going to elaborate on. I think what Nathan has articulated and really hammered home is this idea that what we're getting at is like fear and a sense of failure and fitting in. Those things sell. So we're talking about very moneyed forces in advertising and in politics that are trying to generate reactions, often negative reactions that make people feel less safe, less happy, less whatever, less positive, and then they'll buy the dietary pill or the clothes or the diet Pepsi, whatever. So that's a story, right? That's narrative. And I don't think, and I think what you're saying, Nate, is that isn't the entirety of the internet, but our own existences through technology, if we go on social media to an extent, are being curated. So if technology and these forces, whether it's Facebook or TikTok or whatever, see what your behaviors are, they can quickly pick up on what you're interested in or what you're obsessed with, and they'll be curating an experience for you so you think that you're seeing a representation of the internet and the whole world. And in reality, you might be seeing a very segmented, very curated slice of reality that seems objective and real, and it might be not real at all. You touched on this. Maybe go a little deeper on how the technology, is able to do this and give us using story, but to tell stories that aren't true.
So some of you know this, some of you might not realize this. Basically, everything you do online, right? And in any, whether it's on a mobile device, whether it's on a web browser, whether it's on an app, like whether it's on a VR headset, basically everything you're doing online, they're collecting data about it. Most services now have a connection to the internet and they require some back and forth just to, and a lot of that exists simply to make things work. Right? Like the way these applications work, they have to connect to the internet because they're often relying on a server system somewhere and other sorts of, computational technologies in the background. But what's convenient is that that data can also be saved and analyzed. And so all of these companies that run all these different applications and things that you use and don't think about too much, you just sort of use them. They're collecting data about you, and it's absolutely right. They use that data to tailor the stories that they want to share with you. And they have some so you've been playing, I'll bring up AI because we're probably going to talk about AI. So have you heard of machine learning? Do you know what machine learning is? Does anyone know machine learning? Do you have a definition? Anyone have a definition of machine learning? This is audience participation now. Yeah, correct. It's like a feedback system. So the computer, there's basically a sophisticated kind of statistical algorithm inside the computer that the things you submit to the system become an input, and then it produces output based on those inputs, and then that solicits further input, and it's kind of a feedback system. Yeah.
To add on what you said, it also allows systems to learn from data and improve their performance without being explicitly programmed.
Correct. Yeah. No, go ahead, please.
Back in late 2000s, early, like Google and Facebook both had some AI learning from each other, and they kind of started communicating in languages that humans couldn't speak.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, weird. It can produce weird results like that sometimes. There are some people who describe machine learning. Machine learning is what drives search engines. Machine learning is what drives like Netflix recommendations and YouTube recommendations. The stuff you're recommended all the time, that's a machine learning system. And there are people who kind of describe machine learning as our sort of first contact with AI. It's sort of like an earlier generation of AI. And what you might not realize is that what is usually being done is that the machine learning system is designed to feed you things as part of that feedback loop. It's designed to feed you things that it think will get you to keep engaging with the machine learning system. So in a way, it's kind of like self-defining engagement by what it knows you will click on, right? I'm going to send you more of these because you clicked on the last one and you keep clicking on them, so I'm going to send you more. And so you can quickly see, how that will turn into a rabbit hole of similar things because it's just trying to engage. It doesn't know right or wrong. These aren't moral systems. Their developers should know moral things, but also very often the developers aren't explicitly trying to design a bad system. They're not horrible people, right? Mostly. I mean, maybe a few are, but most of them are like not horrible people. Let's just take that as a given. They're just trying to design a system that engages you. But what kind of winds up happening, and the problem with these companies is they know this and they haven't really done anything to correct it. Engagement turns out to be most powerful when you're angry. Anger is engagement as far as most machine learning systems. So as you're going down the rabbit hole of things it's recommending you things that annoy you and frustrate you and make you want to get online and type angry things to other people. That's what a lot of these systems do. And have you experienced this? You've probably experienced this where you're like I get recommendations sometimes. I'm like, man, that's like really playing to my like worst instincts. So I shouldn't click on that. That's bad. Or have you ever had the one where you like, there's a video or a post or something that's not the type of thing you usually care about, but this one sort of happens to look interesting and you click, and then the super needy machine learning system starts sending you 1 million of those. And you're like, I don't care. Like for me, it's like home improvement. I'll like be doing a project and it's like how to do like sink plumbing. And then for like weeks, I'm just getting recommendations for sink plumbing. I'm like, man, I already did the sink. It's done. I don't care anymore. I don't need it. But it also can be very negative political content or very negative other sorts of content. And it kind of pulls us down. It definitely like pulls us in. I'll expand a little to VR because we've been talking about kind of like old media now, social media and apps. Right? It's kind of old media. For you, it's old media. For me, it happened yesterday. But like VR, I teach VR, right? VR is actually VR is a lot older than mobile devices and social media. Believe it or not, the history of the field goes back to the 1960s. But the current generation is pretty new. And like for a little while, did you ever hear about like the metaverse, Mark Zuckerberg's push to create like a metaverse of VR, interconnected VR experiences? It was going to be like we would start living our lives entirely in VR. It didn't really go anywhere. I think you can think of reasons why, probably. But imagine this power of machine learning coupled to that. And now not only are you reading all these things and you're actually experiencing them. You're like in a VR headset and the world actually really feels like it's that negative or that distorted. And so I'm actually quite glad, believe it or not, I'm not like an evangelist of VR. I'm actually a skeptic of a lot of things. I like to teach how to make the best possible version of these things, but I also think part of that is having a moral compass and thinking about the ethics of what you're doing. I'm actually quite glad the metaverse hasn't really materialized because I don't think it would be good for us. I think it would be bad. So yeah, I don't know. That's a little more about some of the tech and how it like does what it does, at least a little.
Let's so if I say at this point, because last semester it seemed still new. Show of hands, who knows AI? If I say AI, who's like, I know what you're talking about.
I think I know what you're talking about, Dr. Murphy. Like it stands for artificial intelligence.
Very good.
Very good. And anyone in here that doesn't, there's like, what is AI? I don't understand what AI is. Everyone pretty much understands. So there's so many different ways to tackle this, right? But I think it's incumbent upon us to at least address. We can get into some societal implications, but does anyone in here, by show of hands, have an opinion like AI is good for students? Who thinks AI is not good for students? Okay, I don't know the answer, and I didn't know what to expect. When I hear people in media and in the circles that I run in, it's become a bit of a stereotype. Like, well, AI is bad because it's going to allow people to cheat and not do their own work. And so I think at this point, that argument is starting to be defeated because it's so simplistic, it's so alarmist. I'd love your take on that, high level, but then we can downshift or upshift into what are some ways AI actually can enhance the educational experience?
So I think what it boils down to for me, there are a lot of opinions about this right now because it's pretty new. So machine learning, if machine learning is like the earlier generation of AI, the new generation is large language model AI, where we kind of treat every piece of information as sort of a kind of language, and then we allow the AI to sort of assemble that into something that resembles meaning. Sometimes it feels really meaningful, but very often have you heard of AI hallucinations? Do you know what an AI hallucination is? This is when the AI like makes up something because it doesn't have enough data to work with. I'll tell you a funny example. Some of my students know this example. I'm working on a World War I VR project. It's a history education project. And so we were playing around with some kind of commercial off-the-shelf AI systems. You can go down a browser and mess with these things. And I was having a student, we have some soldiers, American soldiers from World War I. These are obscure people. They're not well-known. They're not famous figures. But we were trying to create like an AI version of them that you could have a conversation with, which we thought would be cool. We've done this with some more less obscure figures like founding fathers and things in our lab, and that's been pretty cool. You can like chat with them, and it's kind of like having a conversation with George Washington or Amelia Earhart or like whoever. But these are very obscure people, right? Like you don't know who Lorraine Cunningham is, but he was a lieutenant who served with Harry Truman in 1918 and the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. You don't know who that person is. Well, neither does the internet, it turns out. There's very little information. And so what the AI does, you're going to have a conversation with Lorraine Cunningham, and it starts telling you about how Lorraine, I'm Lorraine Cunningham, and I served with Luke Yeager, who's one of my students now, right? They all know he's like a friend. I served with Luke Yeager in 1918, and we jumped in foxholes and we charged the German lines. And it tells you this story. It's wrong. And it's not just wrong because Luke Yeager is a 20-something-year-old guy in 2024 and had nothing to do with World War I. But the word foxhole, that's World War II. That's not World War I. This is artillery. You don't charge the German lines in artillery unit. You like do a lot of other things that are different. So the AI just like hallucinates this stuff. It like makes stuff up. So for me, so back to your question. For me, what it comes down to is, are you using the AI in a creative way that expands your own capabilities as a person? Is the AI a tool? Just like any other tool, just like Photoshop, just like a programming language, just like a written language. Is it a tool for you to be more creative, to be more independent, to be more proactive, to better yourself? Or is it a crutch that's replacing some of your own autonomy with something the computer is doing? And I think when you're using it as a tool to better yourself, to do something better, that's actually can be really cool, as long as you're aware of the limitations. And there are many more than some people would tell you. But when you start turning the AI into your easy button, I'll just have it write a paper for me. I'll just have it draw an image for me. That's when you start running the risk that you're like, the AI is substituting something really important. And if you take that all the way to its logical extreme, you're actually like getting to the point where we have to ask the question, well, what's the point? If the AI is going to do everything for us, what's the point of being human beings? What are we doing? We're nothing. We don't matter. The AI is what's doing everything, right? We're just lumps of flesh that consume resources. And that's a pretty grim depiction of humanity. That's appropriate for a science fiction book, but probably not for reality, right? I have a question. You probably don't want to answer it, but I promise I won't tell on you this one time. I'm actually curious, have any of you used an AI to like do your work for you? No? Is anyone willing to own up to it? I got a couple, even Tyler. Oh, Tyler. A couple of you have. I bet some of you have, but you don't want to say. It's okay. I won't submit you to our J board or anything. It's really tempting, right? Like it's tempting to me, and I try really hard not to do this, but like there are times when I'm like writing an email. I'm horrible with email, because I don't just write an email and hit send. I like write an email and then I proof it and then I edit it and then I do a second draft. And it's like, even for stupid emails where that's completely unnecessary. It's just it's like a habit I have as a writer. And man, an AI would save me a lot of time because I could just generate a thing and hit send. But I try not to do it because I think it takes something away from me to not craft my own words to send to someone, even if it's just about a meeting time or something stupid, right? But it is tempting, and I get the temptation because your professors ask you to do hard stuff. That's what college is about. But I would encourage you not to do that, because if you're doing that, you're missing the point. Instead of learning and growing and expanding, you're letting something do that for you. And the AI, its machine learning feedback loop is getting better, but you aren't, right? And yet with language, we use a lot of language now. We sort of pay attention to this. If you read articles, or you're talking to people about AI, pay attention to this, because you'll hear people say, I did X, Y, and Z. But then you realize in the conversation that ChatGPT did X, Y, and Z, and they didn't actually do anything. But they'll say, I did X, Y, and Z, and they'll get credited for it because they're the human, right? But they didn't do anything. And it's worth noting when people do that. It tells you something about what they're learning and what they're doing and whether that's good for them or not. That's my sermon on that topic.
Well, seconded, here. I actually think that kind of brings us full circle too, and I think that applies to your educational experience, but also it really kind of illuminates and underscores what we're talking about when we're talking about what story is, how story endures, and why stories that were written centuries ago in different languages are still read and still resonate today. It's because human beings wrote them, and human beings are responding to them. So I think the takeaway for me as a writer is technology is always scaring people, and there are always alarmists saying that the new technology is going to ruin everything. Google was seen as, well, no one's going to learn anything because the internet and Google is going to do it all for you. That's not the case. Google was a tool that could help you go deeper in your research, help you find more sources, help you discover other areas and things you weren't even intending to do when you started writing that research paper. I think AI is the same, that it can be a tool to help you go deeper with your learning. It can even help you take shortcuts, and I think that that's fine. But as Nathan said, if you're using it as a replacement to either learn or tell stories, you're not telling a story that's going to last, and you're not doing anything that's going to last in your own life. So it really is to your own benefit to use these technologies in ways that help you be a smarter, more informed student. You're going to be able to use those skills in all the things you do as you move forward. So really, you're doing yourself a favor to listen to the kind of things that Nathan is saying. I want to be cognizant of time and leave room for questions, but I promised I wanted to talk about, you said something about that would be a good science fiction story. Speaking of science fiction stories, we have a new book in the world that was mentioned up front. Let's talk a little bit about World Without Rain. Nathan, I would love you to talk about the origins of this project, how it went from idea to execution. And I love how that regrounds us in where we started, which is the nature of original storytelling was putting words on a page, and that's how a book comes about. So let's hear about your book.
Yeah, I can tell you about this book. Here's a couple thoughts about this book. So first of all, you asked like how it started. To be honest with you, I've been working on this story for a long time. And the very first kind of versions of it were things I played with when I was where you are now. I was an undergrad in college. I was in a film program. I was interested in stories. And this actually started as like a movie, a random film school student movie idea. And I wrote scripts. They're all terrible scripts. I think the book is a lot better than those scripts. But it took a long time. And it took a long time because a novel, first of all, it's very long. Longer than it should be. I think it moves really well. I think it's paced really well, actually, but it is a long book. So that takes a long time to write anyway. But also, like, you have to work at it. You can't, like, if you're going to write something like a book, you can't do a little bit here and a little bit there and kind of like, and I did that for a long time, for years and years, a little bit here and a little bit there, and reworked this chapter. And you probably, did any of you have like, maybe some of you, it's you, or maybe you have a friend who's constantly rewriting the first chapter of their book? Yeah, it's a habit, right? So my advice, if that's you or if you have a friend, my advice is to let the first chapter be horrible and move on. Keep going, because it's going to be a lot of work, and you're going to eventually have to come back to the first chapter anyway, because even if the language is amazing, your plot's not going to match the first chapter by the time you reach the last chapter. So I spent a long time, and then kind of in the past few years, I sort of committed to sitting down and like really writing. The book draws on, like, I have a lifelong fascination with airships, like real ones. I don't know if you know this, but like during World War I also like World War I a lot, so maybe you can tell. During World War I, the Germans used airships as strategic bombers, and they bombed London repeatedly from the air with airships. It was the precursor to the air bombings that happened in World War II on a much greater scale. There were passenger airliners in the 1920s and 30s that were airship airliners. These are real things. You've probably mostly seen airships in like movies, fantasy type movies, but they were real vehicles, and they're fascinating. They're really interesting. So the story is kind of inspired by that. I will say this, having written a long novel and published it and put it out there, what I think I've come to realize is that technology matters, because a lot of people don't really read paper books. And you're narrowing your market considerably if that's the medium you stick with. And that's something I like, kind of like the smart technology professor in me sort of knew in an abstract way. But like once you put something out there and you like want people to read it and like it, you realize like that's actually that's a lot of, we call this friction in the world of like experience design. Friction is the thing that turns people away. So you've ever like downloaded an app and it's like asking you to do too many things before you can really use it and you just get sick of it and you move on. Sometimes it's seconds, but you don't care. You're like, this is stupid. I'm done. That's friction, right? You've all experienced friction in like user experience design, some app or some game or something you've downloaded and played with. Friction drives people away. And it turns out in 2024, I think unfortunately, but I also think we have to accept the world as it is, reading a paper book is friction for a lot of people, and especially if it's long, right? And so I'm already thinking about ways where I could create other genre, like other media that might appeal to other audiences. Because there are people who still want to read a paper book. I do have an ebook, so some people will read it, but only if it's like a digital ebook. But I've found like I think a lot of people want audio. Listening to books, I think, has gotten a lot more popular for people who are interested in books. I know I listen to a lot of audiobooks when I'm mowing the lawn, when I'm driving places, right? It's a cool format. So an audiobook is a thing I think I should do. But then I also start thinking about like other technologies, VR, and are there ways to like augment the experience in cool ways so that even if you're like mostly reading, you're getting some cool visuals and some interesting like experiences that go along. That would be a cool thing. I don't know if that would attract people. There's friction to technology. Technology creates its own friction, right? But it's thoughts I have. I've also thought about whether there should be a second edition that actually breaks the story up or does other more unique formatting to try to kind of like sucker people in a little bit more. Instead of one big heavy tome, it's like start with this pamphlet. And they're like, oh, this pamphlet was cool. I could go to this got a cliffhanger ending. I could go to the next piece. I don't know if I love that because it breaks up the structure of the story in weird ways, which could be its own kind of problem. But these are things I think about with this book. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, so there's a mini lesson in there, right? You're talking about a story you wrote and understanding that for story to have an impact, we can both accept how technology is changing the way people engage with traditional form, but also embrace that technology means you might be able to reach an audience that either wouldn't meet you halfway or just doesn't have the sensibility to engage with the text. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And that makes it interesting because I think as the storyteller, you're still in control of the narrative. It's your story. I don't think there's any compromise. And I think there's a lot of interesting ways to expand ways of engagement. And I think that's anyone that's telling a story, especially when we're talking about old school narrative like books, the idea is to engage with an audience, to engage with the readership. Why put all that effort into something if you're limiting your readership right from the get-go? So I think what you've uncovered there is kind of like an onion peeling of like how story works and how we make story work, as storytellers. There's a lot of learning there. What did you learn about story by taking the time and the effort to see a novel through? What did you learn about story? What did you learn about yourself as a storyteller?
What I learned about myself as a storyteller is that I'm kind of uncompromising in ways that hurt me in the market. So it is a long book, way longer than they would recommend for like a first novel. I also published it myself, and there's still a little stigma attached to that, actually, which is fine. Like, you go through a traditional publisher and you do gain some benefits in terms of marketing and reaching audiences and other sorts of things. But when I say I'm uncompromising, what I mean is if you publish it yourself, there are some very good tools and very good ways to do that now, and you have total 100% control over your work. So for me, being a professional designer and having a background in graphic design, all the editorial, all the cover work, all the illustration, everything I put in that, I did to a professional standard. Not everyone can do that. There are a lot of self-published books that are horrible. But I was very, very meticulous about that. But I probably produced a book that is less likely to get bought for that reason. And it's kind of interesting, like getting people to buy a book and getting people to read a book is not quite the same thing. And to be quite frank with you, I published this book mainly because I wanted it to stop living on my hard drive on my computer at home. I just felt like I have a good job. I'm not trying to become I mean, if you all want to help me become a best-selling novelist, sure. But that's not really what I'm trying to do, right? I just wanted it to live out in the world and have it be a real thing that people could like check out. So it's really mainly kind of for fun and to sort of explore what that looks like. But I sort of learned that like if I were going to actually try to do it as like a commercial, like a really commercially successful thing, I would have to compromise on some things that I didn't want to compromise on from like a storytelling and a presentational standpoint. And I think that's an important thing to know. It kind of boils down to like, is it more important to you to make a product or is it more important to you to make a piece of art? Right? And to me, it kind of turned out like the art is what matters. I want it to be the story I want to tell. I want it to be written in the way I want to write it. I want it to look the way I want it to look. If that isn't a commercially successful book, I kind of don't care because it doesn't matter too much to me. But then there's that little piece of you that kind of cares, right? Because you're like, but I would love it if people bought it. So there is that. But on the whole, I'm actually pretty satisfied with my decision because I'm very happy with what I put out into the world. And as a web developer, like I'm a former web developer, as a person who makes VR stuff, I'm actually very used to the model of making a thing and putting it out there for yourself. You don't go through a publisher for any of these other formats, right? The formats I'm most used to. There's no publisher. The publisher is just in the way. That would be crazy to introduce a publisher into that. So I'm pretty comfortable with this way of doing it. I think it's actually super cool. But yeah, it definitely requires a bit more work from you in some ways. And it's definitely, you're making a specific choice about how you're putting your work into the world. And there are other vehicles that work differently and have their own advantages and disadvantages. So yeah, I don't know. Those are some things I learned, I think. Yeah.
I'll just say it's another learning moment that the good doctor has teed up for us, which is any story that you're going to put in the world. I know a lot of writers, and even if you are able to access a more commercial success or ways to engage immediately with an audience because if you're following a trend or you're compromising your integrity in some way, you've put a lot of effort and time in your life into something that you don't feel good about. So it calls into question the whole notion of how do we define success and what are we telling stories for? Are we ultimately telling them to feel better about what we've done and what makes our story unique and the people that we were able to reach on a kind of authentic level versus the very fleeting satisfaction that comes from selling and having sales numbers. So, right, right. I actually know, but I mean, you know, then you get into famous musicians, authors, movie makers that are intensely rich and very unhappy. You know, I think we can invoke someone named Elon Musk, right? There are people that are wealthy beyond all measure, and we look at them and go, why are they so unhappy? And there's a lot of stories we can learn within that. You guys have really hung in there. We're almost at an hour, but my policy is no one gets to leave until there's at least one question asked. So somebody has to be the hero for the rest of the group. Okay, we got a question in the front.
What a great question. You're a history major? Or you're just an enthusiast? Yeah, me too. Yeah. Oh, cool. Cool. Yeah. I mean, I'm really interested in any era of history. I like when you're exploring the past, you're like exploring an entirely different world with different rules and different people. And like the science fiction writer in me loves that because that's what science fiction is, except you get to make it all up, right? And so for World War I, it's a mix of things. From a kind of historian standpoint, World War I is this horrible break in history, leading, and I mean, I'm kind of saying that from like a 19th and 20th century viewpoint. Like you can rewind history pretty far and it stops being the same. Like there are other things like that. But for the people who lived in the early 1900s, it was a horrible break from what they were used to, which was the Belle Epoque. It was the like, and this is Europe, right? We're thinking about Europe. It's this era of like very established kind of colonial era empire, rich societies, and then they're used to like European squabbles. For hundreds of years, there's squabbles, and they fight each other over stuff that the vast majority of ordinary people don't care about. But it also doesn't affect the vast majority of people in a super immediate way. And World War I comes around, and they think it's going to be another kind of imperial European squabble, and it turns into the most horrific bloodbath the world has ever seen. And these empires realize that they can dole out punishment like no one has ever seen before with like magical science fiction weapons like artillery and airships and tanks and machine guns and barbed wire and gas, chlorine gas. They have all these insanely awful weapons, and they can dole out this horrific punishment on their enemies, and their enemies are powerful enough to take it for 4 years. And it's just like, it's mind-boggling to me. And so it's fascinating in the way you would watch a train wreck, right? It's like, but then there's also this like, kind of like 14-year-old boy part of me that's like, man, those airships and tanks and artillery guns and machine guns and rifles and all that stuff is so interesting and cool. Like, I'm going to say it's cool. It isn't cool. It's horrible. You would not want to be there. It's like, any of you play Battlefield 1? Do you know this game, Battlefield? Any Battlefield 1 or 2? Battlefield 1 is it's the Battlefield series of games. It's like a shooter. It's like a 64 v 64 shooter type game, or 48 v 48 or whatever it is. And it's World War I themed, and it's completely wrong. It feels like World War I, but like it's not really. It's definitely a video game, but it's an amazing game. It's a great game. But like if they were going to make an accurate World War I fighting game like Battlefield 1, it would be that you spawn in and you drown to death in a shell crater full of poisoned water. That would be World War I. It's a horrible experience, but all the tech, it's a clash of technologies, right? And so it's all very, very fascinating to me just because of like how weird and strange and wrong and science fiction-y it is in a lot of ways. What are your thoughts? Go for it. Well, I'm also very interested in World War II, but World War I is just World War II Part 1. They're kind of the same war. Actually, like historically speaking, Europe decided to have a horrible blood path to extend to the entire world, and they did that until they couldn't do it anymore. And then they took a 20-year break so everyone could rearm and re-equip, and then they did it again with bigger weapons and worse weapons and even more insanity. So they're both very fascinating because like they're kind of very, very connected. But World War I to me is really interesting because you see this, it's much more of a connection of very old world and very new, right? Like you have guys on horses with pikes charging tanks, and you have radios that no one's ever like we kind of lose sight of the fact that in 2024, like some of the tech we think of as brand new, like in World War I, the tech we think of as super old was the new science fiction, and that stuff is just entering the war, and it's like no one's sure how to use it, no one's sure what it's going to be good for. The airplane had been invented 10 years earlier, right? 10 years before the end of World War I, so like 6 years before this. It's brand new, the airplane, and no one knows for sure what to do. And by the end, they're like, airplanes are like a thing. They're launching them off ships, and like they're starting to think about carrier navies and stuff. They haven't done it quite in World War I, but so that's really interesting to me, that like clash of old and new and how kind of chaotic and weird that is. And World War II is definitely got a lot of that, but it's also, we're sort of like expecting it now because we've seen it once in World War I. I think that's my answer to your question. What other questions do you have? I play a game with my classes when I start the semester. It's called Ask Me Anything. You're very welcome to ask me anything. I might not answer, but you can try it. What's your question, Tyler? My, what if Tyler is asking because our project is about the French 75, the M1897 French 75 artillery gun. So that has to be our answer for now. Although there are others, but that one's really cool. Yeah. Oh, interesting. I mean, I'm an American and I'm very patriotic, so I'm always going to pick the Abrams. Always. Pretty much any American tank over any other tank, even if it's not actually correct. F-35 or the SR-71 Blackbird? The like stealth, they're really not the same. They don't have the same mission. They're not the same. This might be getting off on a weird tangent for some people. I mean, the F-35 is a pretty cool plane, I think. It has kind of a weird reputation. I think some people don't love it, but it seems like it's pretty capable to me. But the SR-71 is iconic, right? Like, that's an amazing, amazing, amazing vehicle. So I guess SR-71, that's my answer. Oh, the A-10 for sure. That thing's super cool. I know it's old, but I hope they never retire it. It's so old, but it's super cool. It's such an interesting plane. Yeah, they're amazing. It's like a flying tank, basically. They're really cool. Yeah. What other questions do you have? You can ask me anything. I'll answer. Well, I'll try to. Go for it. Oh boy, to play for the rest of my life. This is a tricky question for me because what I like best in video games are big open world narrative games. But once you've played through them, maybe a couple times, you've sort of seen what the content is. And so for the rest of my life, that might not be a good choice. So I would probably pick one of the more like competitive. I'm not an esports person. I'm not good enough at games to be an esports person. But like I do like the Battlefield franchise, which isn't quite esports, but it is competitive. Or I play like Chivalry 2, which is like a medieval version of that. Those kind of games are pretty fun because they're semi-casual, and I could probably play them for a long, long time and not get too bored with them because it's not about the story that I've run out of. It's about the multiplayer kind of experience. So probably something like that. Maybe Battlefield 1 is an amazing game, so I'll pick that just because I really like it. Or maybe Civilization. Civilization is also a really good game. Probably any one of them would be good. Those are my answers. That's a great question. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I hate games like that. I'm so bad at them. Like that like let's ramp the difficulty up for the masochists. It's just I don't have time to get good at those games, and like that kind of stuff is like you're gonna laugh at me, but like the two newer Star Wars games that are sort of a similar gameplay, but they're much more casual. I had to ramp the difficulty down on those because they were so annoying, and they're nothing like a Souls game. So they're not my favorite Souls games. They're for a certain audience, and they are very successful with that audience, but I'm not their audience. The same is true of like roguelikes. Do you know what a roguelike is? They're like you just do a run until you die, and then you do. It's like I can't deal with it. Like once I've gotten to a point, give me a save. Let me have a checkpoint, please. I'm not good enough to keep doing this. What else? Ask me anything. No, I never have. I played Minecraft quite a bit when it was like older, when it was Mojang, but I never actually did end game content. I was like into it because of my like world building architect brain. So I really liked making stuff and sometimes in creative mode, sometimes in like survival mode, but I never actually did a lot of the end game because you have to do all these weird steps and I never really knew what they were. And that wasn't why I was playing. Have you? Have you? It looks cool. I've watched videos of it. It looks like a pretty fun experience, to be honest. Yeah, cool. Very nice. What else? Ask me anything. Interesting. My mom, it's actually my parents. I'm gonna blame my parents. My mom she's retired now, but she was an English teacher and she is an author. She actually has a number of published books. She's much more successful than I am. She also self-published them actually, but she did smart things for marketing. She framed all of her books around the Adirondacks. Where I'm from upstate New York originally. So she actually had a market baked into her books. They're all set and they're very they're kind of like casual summer beach reading type books. So she was really smart. And so she's actually sold quite a lot of books that way. But she's a writer and she was an English teacher. And I got that from her. And she taught me to read really young and she taught me to be a really good writer. So there's that. My dad is an electrical engineer and he was a college professor. And so I kind of got that techie sci-fi engineer type brain from my dad. And so like I mentioned, I've been interested in storytelling for a long time. I grew up loving to watch movies at my friend's house where we could watch R-rated movies. I wasn't allowed to at home. I came from a very correct family. But my buddy's house, we could watch R-rated movies. And so I really liked movies. I was really interested in movies. I thought they were cool. So I went to school for filmmaking, and that's visual storytelling, but the screenwriting process was interesting to me. And then I realized when I did horrible things as a screenwriter, which was writing a ton of description and trying to dictate performance. You're not supposed to do any of that in a screenplay. It's just a blueprint. I know that, but I couldn't restrain myself sometimes. So I switched to novel because I thought that was a better format. And it is, except it's still too long. I make it too long. That's my biggest problem. So that's kind of where it came from, I think. What else? Ask me anything. What do you got? You're not going to like this, but I hate superhero movies. I hate them. There are some individual ones I like, and to be honest with you, I think they're mostly Marvel. But I like the Wonder Woman movie is DC, right? The first one. It's got World War I in it, right? So I kind of like that one. But mostly probably the couple, and they're mostly the earlier ones, like Iron Man, the first Iron Man, and the Avengers, some of the earlier Marvel ones. Man, those superhero extended universes have overstayed their welcome by about 15 years. That's my actual opinion. I think that we have gone down that road and we have explored those stories and there's nothing left to say, but we keep saying it. And I would love the film industry to start doing something new. That's my honest opinion. Anything else. What they should do is rewind to the 80s and 90s and even earlier, 60s, 70s, whatever, where a film got made on its own merits and, to be honest, was a little bit of a risk. They are terrified of risk, and so they will only make things they have already made that made money, even though if you look at the data objectively, that does not guarantee success at all. They're dumping hundreds of millions of dollars into movies that are based on things that were popular in the 80s and 90s, but the 2024 version is terrible and no one goes and sees it and they take a bath. But they won't take a risk on something new. And I think they should just take a risk on something new. I actually think it would rejuvenate the film industry and people would start caring again, to be honest. I know Marvel movies are fun. Probably, how many here love Marvel and DC movies? They're fun, right? I get it. I'm aware enough to understand why people like them, but I don't personally. There are some individual exceptions. Some are fun, but as a genre, I'm sort of tired of it. That's my honest opinion. What else you got? Yeah. like I said, I like some of them, the ones that are structured and fun, the ones I think are just better storytelling and are doing something more original. I really like some of the 80s classics that I kind of grew up with. Obviously, there's some nostalgia to that, but favorite movie is probably Star Wars, original Star Wars, first Star Wars, 1977. Raiders of the Lost Ark is an amazing movie. But there are plenty of recent movies. Usually when I watch a movie, I don't go to the theater very much. The theater does nothing. Do you like going to movie theaters? Is that fun for you? Some of you? It used to be more fun for me. I don't love it anymore. It feels grimy. I don't know. There's something about it. Yeah, I know. But anyway, I watch a lot of movies at home, and I've watched some things that are pretty recent, and I usually appreciate them when they feel like they're doing something different, like they're trying to not just recreate something that was fun in the past. I don't want another Indiana Jones movie. I like the first one. I like the first trilogy. I want a new thing. Give me a new action hero. The action hero could be anybody. And I would probably be into it if it was well made and a cool story and super, super fun. It does not have to be the character I grew up with for me to care about it and like it. And I think that's something the film industry has lost. So, yeah, I'll watch almost anything. There's like dramas and history movies and adventures and sci-fi, action, whatever, comedies. I like all of it pretty much, except horror. I don't really like horror movies. I don't know why. I just don't love them. Yeah. That's a great question. I direct our Bachelor of Arts, which is less focused on coding. The language I use most, believe it or not, is JavaScript. And that's because I have a background as a web developer and I still sometimes do web stuff. And that's a pretty useful language in the context of web. For VR, my program focuses mainly on Unreal Engine. And so underneath the hood, that's C++, but you usually program it with a visual scripting language called Blueprints. And so those are something I think are really powerful and really cool, and I use kind of fairly often. Our Bachelor of Science degree uses C# and Unity a little bit more extensively. So this crew up here, they all like C# and Unity, right? Yeah. And then I've done a fair amount of Python. Python's a pretty useful, powerful language, so I like that one pretty well. Yeah, but web stuff is like the thing where I actually made a living for a while, so those are the ones I know best. Yeah. Yeah, good. What language do you use in cyber? Python. Yeah, Java is a very popular one. I'm not a very good Java programmer, to be honest with you. I like loosely typed languages where I don't have to keep telling the language what data type I'm using. It's like, I told you once, just figure it out. That was a programmer joke for all of you non-programmers in the room. What else? Ask me anything. I don't know what our time is. We can stop whenever you tell me to.
Why don't we- Let's, there's always a thing in show business, there's the after party.
Yeah.
Those of you that gotta go to dinner or hung in there, thank you for coming.
Yes.
Stay.
Thank you.
Already go, if you have more questions.
Yeah.
You need a peace out. Share.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. It was good to see you here. Thank you.